So, Doctor Who is a show I love. Despite growing up during the peak of the newer series, I've always shown a fondness for the classic era. It has a feeling that cannot be replicated, and I've wanted to express that fondness for quite some time, and so I thought a series of reviews would be suitable. I mean, how long could it take? It's only 155 serials, that's like 3 years if I manage weekly without any breaks. The way I plan for this to work is to review every single Doctor Who serial of the classic era, then have a season review which discusses the season as a whole, plus perhaps even ranking them. We'll see. Obviously, there's only one place to begin with such a massive task, and that's the beginning. The time is 5:15 PM, the date November 23rd, 1963, and a brand new science fiction series is about to begin and change the history of television forever. Here we begin with An Unearthly Child. To begin with, I'm going to explain how I'm going to go about this review, as An Unearthly Child is very different in its structure to most other classic Who serials, most notably in the fact that it's kind of like two shorter serials in one, a single parter followed by a three-parter. This of course comes from the fact that it's the first serial, and with how the story needs to introduce the characters and setting, part 1 is somewhat divorced from the rest of it. Although the plot runs across the entire serial, the break between parts 1 and 2 feels closer to a break between serials. This is reinforced by the fact that the opening few serials of the show would have a cliffhanger at the end, and so the plot runs almost directly into the next one. In fact, in the world where you can argue that part 1 is a separate story from the rest of the serial, you could argue that An Unearthly Child through Edge of Destruction is just one very long serial, given its structure as a continuous story with an overarching plot, which reaches its climax by the events of Marco Polo. Heck, I've always viewed these three serials as a sort of mini-series, but I'll talk more about that when I cover the series as a whole. So, I'll talk about part 1 by itself before moving on to discussing parts 2 through 4 as a whole. An Unearthly Child Part 1, titled An Unearthly Child, is a very unique episode in Doctor Who history. I mean, obviously as the opening episode it would be unlike the average one, but even when compared to other introductory episodes, this one has many unique opportunities. There are multiple perspectives to look at this episode from. The two most notable are those who have watched Doctor Who before and those who haven't, and as the first episode, which was never planned to be repeated, let alone sold on VHS and DVD, it was designed for the latter and never intended for the former. I'll look at it from the intended perspective first, that being the non-Whovian. Watching without any context, the episode has a very creepy vibe at the start. A policeman doing his duty on a dark foggy night outside of a junkyard which contains a police box that has a strange hum to it. The very out-of-place nature of this humming is somewhat unnerving and begins the mystery that this episode builds. The mystery begins properly with the introduction of two of our leads, Barbara Wright and Ian Chesterton, and their interest in the very unusual student, one Susan Foreman. The fact that she has knowledge beyond her years and that of the world means she is bored by science experiments.
For instance, the other day I was talking about chemical changes. I'd given out the litmus paper to show cause and effect.
And she knew the answer before you'd started?
Well, not quite. The answer simply didn't interest her.
Can't solve equations due to needing additional things.
It's impossible unless you use D&D.
D&E? Whatever for? Do the problem that's set, Susan.
I can't, Mr. Chesterton. You can't simply work on 3 other dimensions.
3 of them? Oh, time being the 4th, I suppose. Then what do you need E for? What do you make the 5th dimension?
Space.
And not knowing England doesn't use the decimal system for currency and has no idea how the pre-decimal system works.
But I think you'll find there's a very simple explanation to all this.
Well, I don't know how you explain the fact that a teenage girl does not know how many shillings there are in a pound.
On top of that, we have a strange dancing. The mystery hits its peak when we reach the junkyard where Ian and Barbara have followed Susan home. You know, normal stuff. Obviously, this is something incredibly creepy, but we'll forgive it as the latter events of this serial are basically their comeuppance. And since we can't hold off it any longer, this is where we meet our last main character, the Doctor, after he's had a casual smoke. The Doctor has a very creepy attitude. He talks down to Ian and Barbara, treating them like children, toying with them with his greater intelligence. Within this single episode, and in some ways the entire serial, the Doctor is kind of the villain. He opposes who we see as our two leads and even goes as far as to try and ditch them somewhere in the past so his secret doesn't get out. I'll talk more about the Doctor's character when discussing the view of this as a Whovian, as I think that's the best place for it. But the fact that this is the introduction to the character who the show is clearly named after is very weird, due to the fact that he seems to be the villain while Ian and Barbara are our heroes. The episode subverts itself somewhat by having Ian and Barbara first as the heroes who need to save Susan from the Doctor before flipping to become, and as we see later, working with him. And obviously we have one thing left. The TARDIS.
Close the door, Susan.
Barbara's initial reaction to the TARDIS is a reflection of the viewers. This impossibly massive room existing a police box which is also a time machine is something that just boggles the mind. As a viewer, you're completely unfamiliar with something like this, and it makes you ask questions which the characters ask for you. Now, onto how I first viewed this as a Whovian. Watching An Unearthly Child Part 1 as a Whovian is a very different experience, especially when it comes to the characterisation of the Doctor. Knowing who the Doctor is or who he becomes just freaks you out when you see him. He smokes, he toys with people, and is willing to ditch them in a random place and time just to protect himself. When it comes to Susan, if you're a Whovian, you're probably familiar with her being the Doctor's granddaughter, or even if you're not, you probably expect her to have some connection to the Doctor in the plot. Her peculiarities don't have the same effect on you as your familiarity removes the mystery from her, and so you experience it from a different perspective to Ian and Barbara. Additionally, the TARDIS reveal lacks the same impact, as it's something that happens almost every year nowadays. Overall, this episode lacks the impact if it's not your first episode, or at least a very early one. Although of course the Doctor is compelling because he's so peculiar to someone who knows him. With that look at episode 1 done, let's get to the cliffhanger where the TARDIS materialises in a wasteland and the shadow looms over the area. Moving on to the Cave of Skulls section, the story begins to fall flat. While there's plenty of character beats to enjoy, the story feels very formulaic, ironic as it's the first one. The characters are separated, reunite, but are captured, escape, get captured and escape again. Now yes, I am really boiling down the plot here, but I think that's just how bland it feels. This serial is a lot closer to a historical serial, but lacks the educational element for me to call it one. Now it does give some insight into cave people and how they lived, but it doesn't go full on this as it's still first and foremost the introductory story for our characters, which is admittedly why this serial gets away with the simplistic plot and lacklustre characters. There are only 5 characters outside of our main cast, and while I call them lacklustre, they are still interesting, at least somewhat. Our most main ones are Zar, Her and Cal, Cal being a survivor of his tribe and trying to earn his place in the tribe of Gum, while Zar is the failing leader and Her essentially Zar's girlfriend.
The woman is mine.
My daughter is for the leader of the tribe.
Yes, the woman is mine.
The dynamic between the cave people is based around fire. Zar wants to make fire and prove he is the leader. Her is trying to help him in basically everything including making fire. Cal has his sights on becoming the leader and so also wants to make fire, and the old mother sees fire as a destructive force and so doesn't want it, going so far as to free our TARDIS crew, which leads to her death. There's also Horg, the father of Her. He's the least impactful on the plot, but does get a few good moments.
Yes, I remember how the meat and fire joined together.
But when we get onto our mains, that's where things get interesting. As stated before, the Doctor is unlike his later characterisation. Here he is a far more selfish and untrustworthy character, which leads him to attempted murder.
Let go of me.
What are you doing?
Well, I was going to get him to draw our way back to the TARDIS.
This scene is definitely shocking, and with the later context of the character, for any character we're meant to support, this action is unthinkable. And for a character like the Doctor, it's completely unexpected, and definitely the moment you can point to show how different he was at the beginning of the show, although not the most definite. But despite this, he still gets some nice moments, most notably with Barbara.
You're trying to help me.
Fear makes companions of all of us. That's right.
I never once thought you were afraid.
Fear is with all of us and always will be. Just like that other sensation that lives with it.
What's that?
Well, your companion referred to it. Hope. Hope, Miss Wright.
And even with Ian there's a moment.
You are the leader of your tribe?
No. He is our leader.
If it's a bit out of place given how these two have interacted in this story. Unfortunately, this is where Susan begins her regression to screaming that we'll see for the rest of her run of the show. Although there are later series where she screams far more, Susan goes from a mysterious character who kicks off the show to a screaming girl who will take any chance to scream about anything.
It's his notes. He'd never leave his notebook. It's too important to him. It's got the key codes of all the machines and the ships. It's got notes of everywhere we've been to.
Despite the weakness of the story, I think this is the weakest part of the serial. With an episode, Susan has lost what made her interesting and became what many describe as a traditional classic female companion. Barbara also gets a few moments of screaming, but these are far rarer and usually earned, although it does help with pushing the strong men protecting the weak women cliche that comes up very often in older TV, which is unfortunate, but luckily that didn't become Barbara's character. One final thing to say about this serial is its theme. Although the Daleks is always cited as the first serial to have political messaging, An Unearthly Child is overlooked as being the actual first. The battle for the position as the leader of the tribe, with the most notable scene being when Cal is expelled from the tribe. And Ian's words to Zar.
Remember, Cal is not stronger than the whole tribe.
It also asks questions about what makes a person the leader. The K people see it as the one who gathers the food and can create fire, but they learn to question this somewhat.
The whole tribe drove Cal away with the stones. The whole tribe can collect more fruit than one. The whole tribe can kill a beast, where one of the tribe would die.
Overall, a great opening that falls flat where it goes on. It does a great job of being an introduction, but feels very simplistic later. But I will give it this: Zar waiting in the window for his cue will always be funny. And so now the TARDIS has landed in a strange forest and the radiation detector is pointing to danger. Next time, the Daleks. Originally I was going to end this review by reusing the clip of the Doctor smoking, but while finishing the edit of this review, the news of William Russell's passing was released. Now I don't have the words to really describe this loss. I'm just not one for those sorts of speeches. Plus anything I have to say will have already been said countless times already. But I want to say something, at least to acknowledge this great man who, despite not being the title character, was really the main character for a decent chunk of his tenure. In some ways he carried the show on his back when faced with potential cancellation. I could never truly describe his importance to the show continuing, but he played his part in keeping the show going in those early days and letting it become the long-lasting franchise it is today. You will be missed, William Russell.